Hello everyone, I am Demented Kirby, and welcome to my channel, the Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews and other deck techs. On this first episode of the 4th season of the Brewery, I'll be discussing my take on Child of Alara. If you like this deck or any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. Other ways you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. Patrons get early access to scheduled videos on YouTube, and higher tier patrons get access to the VIP section of my Discord server as well. You can find a link to that down in the description too. In fact, patrons got a chance to see this video earlier. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Child of Alara is a 6/6 avatar with trample for 1 white, 1 blue, 1 black, 1 red, and 1 green. When it dies, you destroy all non-land permanents. Now, this ability used to not work because for a creature to die, it has to enter the graveyard. However, if Child of Alara is your commander, you may choose to send it to your command zone instead, thus never reaching the graveyard and so not triggering its effect. However, recently the rules committee decided to change this rule, so now commanders with death or exile triggers trigger even if you send them to the command zone. Not that Child of Alara wasn't viable before this rule change, but now the deck doesn't have to run so many reanimation effects. That being said, the purpose of this deck is to control the board whenever necessary by sacrificing our commander. Since lands remain on the battlefield, our main win cons will come from this permanent type. One such win con is Valakut the Molten Pinnacle. Valakut needs 5 mountains in play to get online and can only deal 3 damage at a time. However, we don't necessarily use Valakut to ping creatures since Child of Alara can destroy them when it dies. We'll be using Valakut mostly for pinging opponents. Even then, we still have a ways to go. That's why we'll be copying Valakut with Thespian Stage, Vesuva, and Mythos of Illuna. Of these, Vesuva is the best one since it merely enters as a copy of Valakut, whereas the stage needs to be activated to do so. The Mythos can make a token copy of any permanent, including lands, which makes it a great way of copying Valakut. Having 4 copies of Valakut in place suddenly becomes much more viable a win con, since triggering them becomes 12 damage per mountain instead of just 3. It's not that difficult to get these pieces throughout a game, since the deck does run Hour of Promise, which can get both Valakut and Vesuva onto the battlefield at the same time. If you have any of the 3 lands, then you can just look for the other 2 you need as well. Elvish Reclaimer can also be used to find these lands. It might take a couple of turns, but by 3 activations we can have 3 Valakuts in play, so it definitely pulls its weight. It also gets lands into the graveyard, which can also be taken advantage of, but we'll see that in a sec. In order to maximize Valakut as well as getting it online, all of the lands just for mana production have the mountain type. The deck's running 18 mountains, which you can see listed here. These mountains are important since most of them can also tap for other colors since the deck is 5 colored. Fortunately, we can use this to our advantage to help fix our colors thanks to the 11 fetch lands in the deck. Landfall is also a sub-theme to the deck, which we'll see soon enough, so being able to drop multiple lands a turn is helpful not only to move the deck forward and accelerate our game, but to also trigger Valakut and its clones multiple times in a turn too. However, 18 mountains isn't enough. We want all of our lands to be mountains. This is why the deck is running Prismatic Omen and Dryad of the Elysian Grove. Both these enchantments makes all of our lands have every land type, but most importantly, mountain. So every land entering the battlefield will trigger our Valakuts. As a bonus, the Dryad is one of the many cards in the deck that let us drop more than 1 land per turn, but we'll see those soon enough. We can also trigger Valakut multiple times with Scapeshift. Not only can Scapeshift help get Valakut, Vesuva, and Thespian Stage onto the battlefield at the same time, but it can also be used to get a bunch of mountains at once to trigger Valakut enough times to potentially take out the table. Splendid Reclamation and World Shaper can do the same, but with lands in the graveyard. Granted, World Shaper has to die for it to happen, but Child of Alara destroys it and everything else when it dies, so it's no problem. Later on, we'll see why the deck might have lots of lands in the graveyard, besides Scapeshift and Elvish Reclaimer, but resolving Splendid Reclamation with a graveyard full of lands is also another way to trigger our Valakuts enough time to take out the table. These effects from Scapeshift, Splendid Reclamation, and World Shaper put the lands onto the battlefield tapped, but the deck is running Amulet of Vigor for good measure. This way, all these lands entering the battlefield at once can actually be used for mana instead of just burning players with Valakut and its clones. Since Child of Alara is a repeatable board wipe that disallows regeneration, we're able to keep the board clear of non-land permanents when things get hairy. This allows for grindier games until we're able to drop enough mountains to kill the table, making Valakut a very viable win con in this particular deck. Soon enough we'll see how we can control our child and have it explode on command. When I mentioned Dryad of the Elysian Grove, I said that the deck wants to drop multiple lands per turn to both accelerate our game and to make Valakut get online faster. This is why the deck is running Azusa Lost but Seeking, Wayward Swordtooth, Oracle of Moldaya, Mina and Den Wildborn, the Gitrog Monster, and Exploration. Of these, Azusa is perhaps the best one since she lets you drop 2 extra lands instead of 1. Wayward Swordtooth can give us the City's Blessing, making it quite the nuisance by being a 5/5, which can apply even more pressure on opponents. The Oracle might telegraph our next move by revealing the top card of our library. but it does allow us to play lands from the top of our library. If we're able to play more lands per turn, we can keep going. The elves not only allow us to drop an extra land, but we can also bounce a land to give a creature trample. Not only can this make one of our beaters, and we'll see some of them soon, better and get some combat damage through, but we can also bounce a mountain to then replay in order to trigger Valakut. The frog is a 6/6 with Death Touch, which is quite the beater or attack deterrent. Giving a trample with the elves is just icing on the cake. However, it also allows us to draw cards whenever lands enter our graveyard from anywhere, so we can draw a card whenever we crack a fetch land or discard a land card, mill a land card, or sacrifice it by any other method including itself. In any case, the frog is a powerhouse in this deck by many more ways than one. Exploration is just an amazing turn 1 drop. The deck is running 47 lands, so 1 out of every 2 cards drawn is practically a land. That being said, Burgeoning is also included in the deck. Another amazing turn 1 drop. If we draw into a bunch of cards or bounce back some lands to our hand, Burgeoning essentially lets us play like 3 lands outside of our turn by the time we get back to our turn. Even though this depends on opponents being able to drop lands, it's definitely the best one, especially after casting Sunder at the end of the turn of the opponent before us. This might return Valakut and its clones to our hand, but if we have our permanents that lets us play multiple lands per turn on the battlefield, we can play Valakut and all of its clone that turn. Then the next turn we can drop more mountains or in between our turns if we have Burgeoning out. This is another way to take advantage of Valakut. If we have a ton of lands in our hand, we can also discard them all and then use Splendid Reclamation or World Shaper to return them all to the battlefield at once with Valakut and its clones already there, and potentially deal enough damage to take out the table. It's also incredibly backbreaking to opponents since it really sets them back while still allowing you to be way ahead. Speaking of getting ahead, what better way than Farseek, Nature's Lore, and 3 Visits? By now you should know that these are my go-to early game ramp spells, even more so here with so many lands with double and triple typing in the deck. These spells definitely pull their weight. Not only are they cheap to cast, they bring immediate value, especially with Valakut and the other landfall elements in the deck, which we'll see in a bit. Squandered Resources is another way to get some epic mana advantage. Unfortunately, you have to sacrifice a land to do so. However, that's a huge plus in this deck. You can get a ton of mana and also get a ton of lands in the graveyard for Splendid Reclamation and World Shaper. In fact, you can use that mana to cast them and then recover all of your lands. As I mentioned before, the deck does generate some beaters to apply even more pressure on opponents. Omnath Locus of Rage is one way by creating 5/5s whenever a land enters the battlefield, which is usually way more than 1 per turn in this deck. If that weren't enough, whenever it or another elemental dies, it can ping an opponent for 3, with Child of Alara wiping the board. If it does so with a board full of elementals, Omnath will definitely dish out a lot of pain. Similarly, Titania Protector of Argoth creates 5/3 elementals whenever a land goes to the graveyard from the battlefield. With all the fetch lands and ways to sacrifice lands, she can create a bunch of elementals pretty quickly and help apply a ton of pressure on opponents. When combined with Omnath, she can become even more dangerous since the elementals she creates also trigger Omnath when dying. We can also get a ton of tokens with Field of the Dead. Granted, these aren't elementals, but being able to amass a ton of 2/2 zombies is something to scoff at. Valakut shouldn't be the only source of damage towards opponents. With the amount of lands entering the battlefield at once and wiping the board with the child, we can recover our board state via zombies to overrun opponents' creatureless boards. So it definitely hastens our victory. One of the many ways we're going to take advantage of getting lands onto the battlefield, drawing is one key one. What's great about this synergy is being able to draw into more lands to keep playing them to keep drawing until we've reached the limit of how many lands we can play in a turn. Tatiova Benthic Druid is such an amazing card for this. She also gains us life as a bonus. Getting Nissa Vital Forces emblem is a similar effect and very easy to achieve as well. You just need her to stick around for 2 turns. Her +1 animates a potential blocker, but if you cast her after wiping the board, it's even easier to get her emblem. We can just draw cards the old-fashioned way also, with casting Sphinx's Revelation, Stroke of Genius, or Pull from Tomorrow at the end of the turn before ours. With the insane amount of lands we'll have in play, we can sink a lot of them into these cards and draw into a ton of cards, both to fill our hands with lands as well as responses, which we'll see soon enough. We can also draw a ton of cards synergistically. Return of the Wild Speaker can draw us a ton of cards off of Child of Alara, the Gitrog monster, any elemental token, etc., all at instant speed. However, that's not the only way. Life's Legacy, Morbid Curiosity, and Momentous Fall can do the same, but preferably using Child of Alara since we have to sacrifice a creature with them. So not only can these spells draw us a ton of cards, but they also serve to kill off the child in order to trigger its board wipe ability. These cards are definitely all-stars in the deck. Notwithstanding, Diabolic Intent and CDC Undead Vizier are also included for the same reason. These tutors require a sacrifice, and what better sacrifice than Child of Alara. These synergistic tutors are used more as extra copies of Hour of Promise since it can get both Valakut and Vesuva onto the battlefield at the same time. So they serve double duty. triggering the child's board wipe ability and hastening our win con. However, as I just mentioned now and earlier, we need to be able to control Child of Alara's ability since it's a recurable board wipe. We need to be able to sacrifice it at will. The previous spells gain a lot of value from doing so, but we might have to do it multiple times throughout a game until we're able to win. Grim Backwoods, High Market, Keldon Necropolis, Mirren the Moaning Well, and Phyrexian Tower. Of these, the best ones are the free ones like High Market and Phyrexian Tower. That being said, these are super important to be able to trigger Child of Alara on command. Lands are the only permanents left on the battlefield afterwards, so with these out we're able to trigger a board wipe whenever we need to. They each provide an effect for the sacrifice, but honestly, the important part is that these lands do not enter the battlefield tapped, they can provide mana, and they trigger Child of Alara. Westfield Abbey can also do the same, but you need 4 more creatures to do so. However, this land is included because it's a good mana sink for providing chump blockers, but can also be used to sacrifice elementals with Omnath in play. Additionally, once transformed, it becomes Orumdal, a 9/7 demon with flying, lifelink, haste, and, more importantly, indestructible. With him on the board, triggering Child of Alara would just leave him there to give quite a smack to an opponent, all while gaining a life in the process, just in case. We can also sacrifice Child of Alara with reanimation effects for double the efficiency in the deck. Rescue from the Underworld and Blood for Bones are amazing here. The former just due to the fact that it's an instant, so we have an instant speed way to trigger Child of Alara without it being telegraphed. As a bonus, both the child and a creature from our graveyard return to the battlefield at the beginning of our upkeep, so it's a great way to recover anything we lost to a board wipe. Same with Blood for Bones. What's great about Blood for Bones is that we're able to reanimate the child even if we sacrificed it as a part of the cost of the spell, so it's like a sorcery speed rescue from the Underworld. A quick note on these types of spells. Even though Child of Alara works much better now due to the June 7th, 2020 rules update, we can't just cast it indefinitely from the command zone. There will come a point where the tax is just too high. Child of Alara should be sent to the command zone from the graveyard as a state-based action only if you would need to re-trigger its ability again relatively soon afterwards. This is the only benefit from this rule. This means that we don't have to run as many reanimation spells in the deck as previous versions. That being said, we should still run the best of them, which is what I'm going to discuss now. Gift of Immortality and Fool's Demise are the best reanimation effects for Child of Alara. With it being enchanted by any of these, it returns to the battlefield after dying or being sacrificed. Of the two, the former is better since it returns to the battlefield for free at the end of the turn, where the latter returns to our hand. That being said, it's reliable and recoverable ways of triggering Child of Alara's ability. Minions return and supernatural stamina can also do the same thing but only once. Since these can be done at instant speed, opponents won't be able to prepare for this degenerateness, unlike with the previous 2 auras, since they might not expect to see the child return to the battlefield after being triggered. This is amazing to do at the end of an opponent's turn so that the child does not have summoning sickness when it's your turn. That way it can attack into an empty board. Journey to Eternity can also do the same but better, since afterwards it transforms into Atzol, a land that can then be used to reanimate the child for 5 mana each time, which is way cheaper than recasting it. Since it's now a land, it won't get destroyed when the child triggers. With this on the battlefield, you can blow up the table with total disregard, since you can reanimate the child from the graveyard afterwards, no problem. Footsteps of the Goryo also requires the child to be in the graveyard, but it's essentially a board wipe for 3 mana since it reanimates the child just to have it sacrificed again at the end of the turn. So if you have this in hand when you're triggering the child, do not send it to the command zone afterwards, since you can use this to get it back for way less mana than recasting it. Also, keep in mind that Child of Alara is a 6/6 with trample, so more than likely opponents are losing life via other ways too. So never lose track of that. 21 commander damage wins you the game. So if we're able to wipe the board but regain Child of Alara, we can send it to an open board to potentially eliminate an opponent, especially with Kessig Wolfrun. With all of our lands in play, we can sink it into this land to make Child into a 2-turn clock or a possible 1-shot kill with enough mana. Since it's on a land, it survives Child's trigger, so it's a great way to consistently pump it for the win. Okay, so we're constantly blowing up the board and being as evil as possible. Sometimes we have such an amazing board state that we don't really want to lose it. Or maybe an opponent attempts to destroy the child because our board state is the best one, and this will hurt us more than the rest of the table. Don't fear though, because the deck's running Heroic Intervention and Boros Charm. Casting these in response to the child's ability on the stack means that we'll be the only ones with our board state intact afterwards. This can be a win con in and of itself, since we can then send our creatures out into empty boards and potentially take out an opponent or two in the process. Gerard War the Light Hero can be exiled due to its death trigger, but he only returns artifacts and creatures destroyed this way back into the battlefield. If done during our own turn, we won't be able to attack with the creatures that came back. He also won't protect our enchantments. However, he is a 3/3 with first strike for 4 mana, so he can also be used to attack with. If he's on the battlefield, we can also trigger the child without worrying about keeping mana open for other reactive spells just in case, so he does have its merits. Lastly, Teferi's protection can be used to protect everything. When cast in response to the child's trigger, we simply phase out and let opponents deal with their situation until we phase back in later with a better board state than the rest of the table. Evil, I know, just like Teferi in the current standard. We can also protect our creatures from targeted spells with Sylvan Safekeeper. Not only that, but it can also be used to get a bunch of lands into the graveyard to then get them back with Splendid Reclamation or World Shaper to trigger Valakut a bunch of times. It also only costs 1 to cast, so it's definitely an all-star in the deck. Responding to our own Child of Alara trigger isn't the only responses in the deck. We have to protect our board state, especially from spells like Armageddon and Ravages of War. Mass land destruction can really set us back. Sure, we can cast Heroic Intervention and Boros Charm, but we still need more ways to interact with opponents too. Negate, Swan Song, and Dobbin's Veto are cheap ways to deal with such threats. We're more worried about what opponents can cast during our turn, but likewise we want to counter any indestructible spell of their own. Last thing we need is an opponent also being ready and casting a Heroic Intervention of their own. Anguish Unmaking and Cyclonic Rift help against permanents like Avacyn Angel of Hope, Eldrazi Monument, etc., pretty much any permanent that will give their other permanents indestructible. Again, we want to prevent opponents from getting a board state better than ours at all times, since we're built for taking advantage of grindy games as well as potentially winning in one fell swoop. Bojuka Bog deals with graveyard strategies, especially Reanimator decks, since they really aren't as set back as other decks from incessant board wipes. We can also trigger it multiple times by bouncing it to our hand and replaying it, or sacrificing it and then getting it back onto the battlefield from the graveyard. The rest of the deck is just the rest of the lands. I already mentioned most of the lands throughout the course of the video, but the remaining ones are Command Tower, Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth, and one of each snow basic land in case opponents are running anything that benefits us for it. Urborg is here in case we have nothing else to fetch for, so that the fetch lands can at least tap for mana in case we don't have Prismatic Omen or Dryad of the Elysian Grove in play yet. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Child of Alara. Even though I built a grindy deck focused on abusing Valakut and other landfall and land loss triggers and other hijinxes, you can also brew a Maze's End version of this deck as well as a manland tribal version of the deck. That being said, I build it this way since I like being able to take control of which lands I have by fixing colors with the fetch lands and also being able to ramp easily for them with the ramp spells in the deck. Being able to get multiple lands in a turn just by fetching or ramping helps trigger those effects even more. That's my preference at least. So if you're interested in the deck list of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the brewers, for their patronage. I'd also like to thank anyone using my TCG Player affiliate link. That also helps out the channel. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am Demented Kirby, and happy brewing.